Hello, hello, and welcome to Biblically Speaking. This is your girl Cass, and this is our weekly recap of the episode that was released this week earlier. And if you're confused, we release an episode on Tuesday about biblical versus secular timelines. This is where we discuss with Dr. Robert Carter, who is an esteemed scholar who was featured on that Amazon documentary. I don't know if you've listened or watched it. Highly recommend it. It is like the gateway drug into what we're about to discuss on this channel as a whole. But how does the biblical versus the secular world interact? Is Genesis history takes like 12 different biblical scholars and looks at archaeological evidence, genes, genetics, biology, floods, like global catastrophes, and say, did this, like, we see the science of this in our world, we study it in schools. Is this reflective of what's said in Genesis? And I saw that about 2 years ago and I was like, oh my gosh, yes, this is exactly the content that I need as a Christian that like does not understand the intersect of what I'm taught and what I'm told to believe. And it was just this like beautiful group of scientists that were supporting Genesis through their scientific work. I fell in love with that, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna do that with my channel. Let's get on the scholars and do the exact same thing, but with my questions, because I don't have a lot of questions about like genes and fossils. I want to talk about like, did these miracles really happen? Was the flood actually global? Did it actually happen? Was it like a story? Was the world created in 7 days? Why are people living so long in the Old Testament and they're not living as long in this day and age? I just, so many questions for me. I finally got one of those scholars. I actually have two. Marcus Ross is coming on in the future, but this week we had Dr. Robert Carter, who specifies in marine biology, genealogy, timelines, and genetics. And so he came on the show, and I was like, listen, I know that there's a global world history. There's Chinese history and American history. There's the Roman history. There's the Greek mythology. There's the pyramids. What was going on in the world for just the stories we were reading in the Bible? Or does the Bible as a whole encapsulate global history as we're led to believe? Like God created the heavens and the earth. But the Bible doesn't talk about the pyramids. The Bible doesn't talk about like the Roman Empire to the extent that we know it. So is it covering it? Like that's a genuine question. Is it? Or is this just like the Bible covering a little bit of world history just for Christian history? And that was operating and existing within a giant global history that the Bible does not acknowledge. That's basically what this episode is about. And boy, oh boy, like this is, he said at the end, this is a 3 day conversation. And I think he was right. Like we covered a lot. And I'm going to do my best in this next 20 minutes to recap as much as I can on like what my authentic thoughts were my questions answered. But like there's more. There's so much more. But listen to the episode if you haven't, and then come back. But if you don't have time, here we go. So let me pull up my notes here. So I think the biggest thing about Dr. Carter is that a breath of fresh air as a human being, just genuinely fun to talk to, and he also loves his job, which is so clear when you talk to someone. I mean, he enjoys genealogy, he enjoys marine biology, diving, and he knows that there are answers to his faith that science can explain, or that there's answers to his faith that we can see in science. One of the things that got him started though was he was like, evolution just can't be possible. Like this just can't be explained. How can we have microbes that then one day decided to walk? Like that is such a far jump, and just the deeper we get into scientific discoveries and history, that just simply isn't going to work. And him as a scientist with his field, I mean, he was teaching classes and he's like, what? This isn't even explained. Like we just have a divide between the people that believe and the people that don't, but there's no explanation that can bring more people over to make it make sense. I mean, we are logical people. So he kind of jumped on board for the work that he's doing because he realized there wasn't a lot of guidance in the realization that the age of the earth is not billions of years old. There's just two schools of thought, old earth versus young earth thinking, but there's not a lot of guidance that says for the young earth from the scientific community. So before we get into all that, you're probably thinking like, well, younger, older. Yeah, that's like totally a discussion that people have, is that like some people, like maybe you're just like, oh, obviously, like, but sometimes you just gotta acknowledge things. Sometimes we just have to say things, is that there are some people that think the earth is billions of years old. And the creation story is representative of different epochs of time. I covered that with Dr. Ross of saying like each day in that creation story of Genesis represents millions of years. And that's how we can justify the old earth theory. Young earth is essentially saying, no, that is a literal interpretation of Genesis. The earth was created in 7 days by God, and all of the world history that we've ever known can actually be described as happening within the last 6,000 years old, within the last 6,000 years. Um, and all of the chronologies that we understand of like kings and dynasties in history fit within that 4,000 year period until Jesus's birth. How? That's what we essentially describe on this call because that's what he believes. I mean, Dr. Carter believes in a young earth perspective and that it can be explained based off the data, the carbon dating, the chronologies and histories and genealogies that the Bible represents can be reflected, and the maths out. I'm so glad this isn't my job. Oh my gosh, but he does it, he believes it, and he explains it in this episode. The other thing that he points out is naturalism. So naturalism is essentially saying that everything has occurred naturally. There is no God. There is no miracles. Everything can just naturally occur within nature. It's all that, it's a philosophy, it's a belief. Natural processes and forces can be used to explain everything that's ever happened in the history of the universe. So that's where we get like the Big Bang theory. That's where we get the naturalistic origin of life theories. That's where we get evolution. So again, no miracles, no God, no outside forces. So God existing or not existing is irrelevant because naturalism is going to naturalism. It's going to just cause the next natural process. There is no life force that's pushing it forward, causing direction, adding complexity. Like my brain was tying in knots in real time on this episode. Like I think I admit to it out loud, but I'm like, what? So this is one of those things where there is a Bible that operates within the scientific community. You don't have to sacrifice one or the other. You can see that there is complexity, that there is intention within science, within nature, without it existing just at a whim, essentially. He doesn't think that everything's going to just occur naturally. He has this higher understanding that the creator of the world is going to surpass the logic of evolution, that God created nature within its own laws that operates within itself, not against it. So once the world caught up with the available data of the complexity of these natural processes, the less probable naturalism can even be explained. So as we learn more, I mean, like maybe 100 years ago, right after the Enlightenment, it's like, okay, well, like we know about nature and nature's kind of like moving along without our interaction. I think nature is just naturing. So there's no God. Like that type of thinking makes sense 100, 500 years ago because there was not data. They did not have the technology to really measure how complex nature can be. Now we do. Now we have more data. We have more technology. They're able to say, whoa, this is very complex. So complex, there has to be a creator. And it disproves naturalism. Do you catch that? So I think that we hold on to these schools of thoughts without taking into account how much we're actually evolving technologically wise to now say, oh, technology is actually proving God. It's not proving away from God. So there's this, based on the biblical record, evolution is not aligned with the order of creation, right? Anybody can read Genesis 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The order at which God is creating the world does not align with what evolution is saying. Okay? God is purposely thwarting any naturalistic explanations because you can't have plants on day 3 millions of years before you have the sun on day 4. You can't have birds and bats, the flying things, on day 5 before you have land animals on day 6, because evolution is going to say those things evolved from land animals. And that says the old earth is not possible. If you want to write it in Hebrew, 6 consecutive days, you would write it exactly how Genesis 1 reads. That is a direct quote from the episode itself because he explains it so well. And I really like that Dr. Carter acknowledges how insane this is. Like, I'm not saying all this and I'm like, see, logic. Like, no, this is cuckoo bananas. This is crazy what we believe. And I think we can say that without blaspheming the word of God, that this is a crazy thing to think, because I think we buy into science because it makes sense. it appeals to our logic of like, hey, that kind of makes sense that like one thing built off another and it created the next thing, survival of the fittest. That makes sense. And God's like, when did I say I was going to make sense? God is basically saying like, yeah, it is crazy. That's why it takes faith. If it made sense, everybody would do it. And then you would put your faith in what? Your own logic? Like that's hard. That's hard. And this is what Dr. Carter says. He's like, if we believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that's quite laughable. If we believe he didn't actually have a father, a human father, that's ridiculous. If Jesus said, I'm going to come back from the dead in 3 days, that's crazy. But he did. So if we are going to put our mind, body, soul, spirit, strength in the fact that Jesus died on the third day, okay, we buy into that. That's like the crux of Christianity. Okay, Jesus died and rose from the dead on 3 days. He died on the cross for our sins. Like, we have to believe that. That is Christianity. So if we believe something as crazy as that somebody died on a cross and rose from the dead in 3 days, and is now living and looking over us, it's a living God. If we can buy that, why can't we buy the creation in 7 days? Why is that the point that we need to start adding science to? We got to start adding logic to. That doesn't like okay, but that doesn't really make sense. Like, you've already bought into somebody resurrecting from the dead and forgiving all of your sins. So what's so crazy about like a God being intentional in his design in a way that doesn't align with our logic, because it hasn't from the beginning? Running my own podcast, I'm always moving too fast. I'm finding guests, I'm editing episodes, I'm creating reels or guesting on other shows. Not to mention, I just live in a world that moves fast. Notifications, trends, endless to-do lists. You know what feels like a blessing in all that? Slowing down. I'd love nothing more than a moment to pause, be present, and choose something timeless. That's exactly what Dwell Label is all about. When I first discovered Dwell Label, it wasn't just about the clothes. It was about a mindset. Thoughtful, intentional fashion that doesn't scream for attention, but instead invites you to slow down. Their pieces are modern takes on classic styles, made to last, not just for the season, but for years. I love that I can throw on a Dwell Label outfit for editing in a coffee shop, Bible studies, or looking professional in an interview. It always feels right. Comfortable, effortless, elevated. And here's the best part. Dwell Label does not just talk about rest. They live it. Their website literally doesn't work on Sundays because they believe in pausing and dwelling on what matters most. So if you're looking for high quality, timeless fashion that aligns with a lifestyle of intention and presence, I can't recommend Dwell Label enough. Shop Dwell Label with the link in the show notes and use my code BIBSPEAK15, BIBSPEAK15 for an exclusive discount at checkout. Take a breath, slow down, and dwell in the good things. Now, back to the show. So, with that all being said, you don't have to completely become illogical, all right? You can just use your brain. Just use your brain and think about things that you know and think about things that you don't know, okay? Just know the difference. Just because you know the boiling point of water, right? You can rely on science there. That's what I'm saying. Do we know that fish grew legs and walked on land? No. That's something we buy into. That's something that we're just kind of connecting the dots. So, as a Christian, what do we know and what are we buying into? I know that I put my faith in a God that fulfills his promises. So him saying, I rose from the dead in 3 days, I can put my faith in that. I don't know that fish. I don't know that fish. That fish owes nothing to me. I can't say I know that evolution took place because I don't know that kind of thing. But I do know God's promises and how he fulfills them. I do know that scientifically, when you reach 100 degrees Celsius, it's going to boil. I think we just got to use our brains, guys. I don't think we can generalize all of these things or group them entirely. Like, this is something we just got to use the brain for. We have quite a bit to get into. How long ago was the 7 days of creation? That's basically the question here. The Bible lifespans, so this is where he gets into the numbers. And I really want to create some guides and tools here that create a visual representation of what he says. Because to me, it's really important to know, like, when was day 0? When was Jesus? Now we're here. In that timeline, when were the Romans? When were the pyramids? When were the Chinese dynasties? That's what I want to know. And there's a lot of great tools out there. I'm going to do my best here to create something simple. So stay posted. If you are interested in getting that guide, jump into the Biblically Heard community through the link in my bio. It's a free community to join, but that's where all these guides are going to live. Okay, so now this is what Dr. Carter said. The timelines. How long ago was the 7 days of creation? Well, the Bible is going to span from Adam to Noah, 10 generations. That is going to be an estimated 1,600 years based off of the deaths and births that were listed in the genealogies of the Bible. We always say, like, what's the point of all these genealogies? Here we go. We're always wondering, like, when was this? God literally told us. We just had to, like, think outside the box. Those genealogies serve a purpose. Papyrus is not cheap. They're going to serve a purpose. So I'm not going to do that. The scientists and the smart people are going to do that. And they said Adam to Noah is 10 generations. That is 1,600 years. And that's like 1,600 plus or minus, because it's not saying that like everybody was born on the same day or died on the same day. Like it's like plus or minus 6 months. Okay. There's not like a lot of issues here that we have in that estimation. But there's also issues of, again, they are not counting and doing things the same way we did today. This was, again, a long time ago. So they might be, I don't know, how many days was a year back then? When they say, oh, I was born on this year and I lived until this year. Well, how long was a year to you? What calendar were you guys following? Was it based on the lunar timelines? Was it based on days? Were they counting months to birth or months to death versus years until birth? They need to now group these into like months of 12. So a couple things to consider. And that's going to be a theme throughout this conversation, is there's a couple things to consider because, again, people back then were not doing the same things that we do today. So we cannot approach these issues in the same way we would approach them today. Moving forward, post-world flood. And the reason that we do Adam to Noah, it's just that's clean, start at Noah, wiped clean. There's now only 8 people, okay? We can start that as, again, like kind of like a day zero situation. So post-world flood is considered the antediluvian era, post-flood, antediluvian. And Noah at this point is 600 years old. 10 generations later, we then have Abraham. And this is when we start seeing the decay of lifespans. Okay, people were living to crazy lengths in Genesis, but around Abraham, people start living to like very normal lengths, like 120 years old. And one of the questions that I posed to Dr. Carter was, well, why? Like, is this like a punishment from God? Is this going to be now him saying like, sorry, you guys were living way too long. Like the things got out of hand when you guys were 900 years old. And again, that's just like my Sunday school mentality where I get into this. And this is why we love scientists, is because they approach it with logic. And he's like, no, mutations didn't just become a modern day issue. Mutations in the genetic build have always existed. So if that's the case, then mutations were starting at Adam. I want to take a moment to highlight the platform that's revolutionizing the way that people learn about the Word of God, school. When I first started this podcast, my goal was very simple. I wanted to equip people with clear, accessible, biblical understanding through scholars. But I quickly realized that podcasting alone wasn't enough. I wanted to create a space where people could actually connect and learn and dive deeper beyond just listening. That's when I found School. School is the most user-friendly platform I've ever come across. It's built by Sam Ovens with insights from business minds like Alex Hermosi. School combines the best of online education, coaching, and community in one place. It's intuitive, powerful, and it connects you to a global network of learners and teachers. That's why I launched Biblically Heard, a place where you can chat with scholars, take courses from beginner to expert level, and even connect with me directly. So if you're looking to build a coaching business or launch an online course or create an engaged community, School beats out every other tool. It combines the best of Patreon-style tiered services and Telegram-style community feeds. It's a seamless scheduling tool with integrations with Zapier, Zoom, and even Google Calendar. If this sounds like the right platform for you, please use my affiliate link in the show notes below to get started. It won't cost you anything extra, and it keeps this channel going. Now, back to the show. So there's 3 things to be said about mutations. Intermarrying causes birth defects. It did then and it does now. Okay, we're not going to say that they were in a special realm of like anti-birth defects because they were intermarrying. However, we got to think about mutations take time to build up. So if Adam and Eve are of pure genetic code, and we can say that because why would God create humans with issues in them? We can assume that God's going to create a perfect human being that is pure from mutations. Those mutations will build up over time, though, from the duplicates of genes. Okay. So they, at Adam and Eve, yes, the siblings, the daughters, brothers and sisters, cousins, they are intermarrying, but mutations have not evolved yet because their code was so recently created, their genetic code. Number two, we see it within Noah's generation. That's why they start occurring then. At Noah's generation, mutations have now built up for about 1600 years. That's why we now start seeing the effects of that. And so we see the shortened lifespan, but also we see birth defects throughout the Bible. I think that we miss it because of the language that's being used. But let's say Jacob, Esau's brother, he was covered in hair. And then we had Jacob's wife. She had weak eyes. What does that mean? Is that an idiom for she was blind? Did she have a lazy eye? Was she just not pretty? We don't know what that means, but it may be a birth defect from intermarrying. And then Abraham's wife, she couldn't get pregnant. That could have been because of mutations and defects. I'm pretty sure I might get this wrong, but Sarah was his half sister. We clarify in the episode. This is just my reflection. And then third, we see these giants that had multiple fingers. I think he was like polydactyl syndrome. I think that's what he called it. And that is a common impact of birth defects, mutations, and intermarrying. So all these to say is like, these shortened lifespans that we see once around Abraham's lifespan, which was around 10 generations after Noah, we have Abraham's generation. And that's when we start seeing those shortened lifespans because of the intermarrying, the mutational code, and the things that still affect us today because we have 6,000 years worth of mutations. Of course, we have birth defects if we have any sort of incest. Back then, it was still building up over time. We have to take into account that like humans have been evolving in the same way as they do now that they were in the past. It's just we've reached a certain point, which I think, that checks out for me. I don't have any questions there. So then I get into secular events, and it's really important for me of like, okay, while Jesus, or not even Jesus, like while Abraham was wandering around and during Moses and during this time, what was going on in other cultures, different parts of the world? If the Bible is truly like world history, then what's going on for the events that are not being recorded that are still happening? Because I think that creates that divide. He's saying that the first Chinese dynasty, this is going to be decades after the Tower of Babel. All the other history we talk about, like the rest of the world, has to take place within the 500 years of Noah to Abraham. Essentially, it's like 500 to 1,000 years. That's like the true dark ages. That's going to precede civilization, written society, agriculture. This is going to be the pots, the bones, and the graves history. So that's going to take place within that 500 to 1,000 year span from Noah to Abraham. Think about how crazy it was before Noah. Okay. For reference, the Dead Sea Scrolls are not until 2,000 years after Abraham. So like the global timeline, the global timeline is happening within this period. It's just not recorded in the Bible. One thing that also needs to make sense is like, I came into the conversation like, no, weren't the Egyptians like, wasn't their history so long that they had historians to study Egyptian history because it was so far? And again, this is when we need to take into account all the things that are happening. And back then, there were still politics happening. There were still power dynamics happening. Maybe we erased some history back then because that's what worked politically for the person in power, like it did with the Egyptians. And if you do the timelines for all of these in the accurate way that takes into account everything, it actually fits within the biblical timeline, which again, I'm not doing that math. That's why we bring on scholars, and I'm going to trust them over my YouTube University skills. So this is what Dr. Carter said about the Egyptians, is that in the global timeline, the Egyptians are going to manipulate their historical record to artificially extend Pharaoh's reign in order to politically look longer, stronger. The reign has been longer. And also by leaving out the pharaohs and the people in power that they didn't like, such as the pharaoh that believed in only one God. Pretty convenient to leave out that God when you live in a polytheistic society, right? Okay. They also left out like King Tut. So like people that we know of today, because we've studied it, they were leaving it out. So when we look at the chronology of the pharaohs, it looks very extended because it's like this reign of this pharaoh was this many years, and then the next one started right after that. If you do it chronologically like that, it's going to extend many, many years because you've got multiple lifespans stacked right after another, versus the reality of the situation, which is these people are reigning kind of at the same time. So their timelines are overlapping. And if you accurately depict how it actually happened with that overlapping of rain, the timeline shortens and actually fits. That's what I want you to take out of that. And to me, that makes sense. I'll check out with that. I can move forward with that fact that I simply was not there. Things change. You rewrite history. That's why we have so many issues with history today. What's being censored out? What's being overlooked? 2,000 years from now, it's not going to make sense. It's only going to make sense if you were there. And I think it's the same thing if you apply it back to these Egyptian, and even like Chinese dynasties, how that was recorded versus how it was actually played out. So this history chunk of time and inaccurate records are huge issues that are known within archaeological circles. They just don't know what to do with these gaps, these facts, these things that they can't fill. They're known. People know about them, but do we have solutions? Do we have answers? No, we weren't there, but we can draw conclusions. So then I lean into the next thing. Well, what about carbon dating? Where does carbon dating play a role? Because can't we just like carbon date and get numbers? Isn't that like what we did to get the billions and billions of years old? Why can't we trust that? And he said it's okay up until the time of Christ, because essentially what happened is that there's the Hallstatt disaster, which is an event that showed, I think it was in maybe the 40s. Again, watch the full episode, guys. This is the recap. I'm not the scholar for a reason. If you want to know exactly what he said, go listen to the episode with Dr. Carter. I think it's episode 47 on Spotify and Apple. So the Hallstatt disaster is something that happened a while ago. And it's an event that showed multiple years of rock formation for different periods of times, dated to the same age, which makes no sense, but it does highlight the reliability of carbon dating. If you look at archaeological evidence, let's say that the Battle of Jericho, that was a whole town. The walls fell. There was no entry. There was no plundering. The walls fell. Like those remains can be found archaeologically. We can find the walls. We can find the town. Everything is still there. And it was deserted for X amount of years, just like the Joshua prophecy said. If you look at the carbon dating for the Old Testament with the Battle of Jericho, the carbon dating dates it to 200 years prior to Joshua's arrival. Eee! That's scary that like the dating is going to misplace it. So we can't really trust that dating. However, we know when it is based on archaeological evidence. I don't know. So what caused this? All elements need to be considered when taking into account carbon dating. And you go back in time and you assume the Earth's magnetic field was, let's say, stronger, something that I do not understand. Like there was like many times within this conversation we had to go over the Earth's magnetic field. I just simply haven't done enough research on this, so it's hard for me to even like visualize, to understand, and ask questions. I hope that I'm not alone in this, but I hope that you guys at least listen and understand what he's saying. But if there was a stronger magnetic field for the Earth, that means, apparently, that there would be less carbon 14 in the atmosphere. So anything you date will have less carbon 14 in it than it should based on the modern amount that we see today. So as you get closer to the flood, you get an inflation of the carbon dates. So all this to say is we can't just take a blanket carbon dating approach to history. There's way too many factors at play. He even gets into some more during the episode itself that goes into, dating bones of fishermen looks or is completely inaccurate. And then you take into account how much fish and calcium and carbon would have been in their diet because they lived near the ocean. And once they take into their diet, then the carbon dating lines up. So again, like it's not a blanket approach, but also we weren't there. So it's hard to understand which elements to include and exclude. So I'm going to move on from carbon dating because I don't understand it. Go listen to the episode and Dr. Carter will explain it so much better than me. One of the fun games that I wanted to play was where would Dr. Carter place my Science Class 101 events with the biblical timeline? Starting with the first one, dinosaurs. He says pre-flood. Those dinosaurs were living before the flood. And that flood that experienced with Noah is going to cause the fossil remains. You've got Adam, you've got 1600 years where dinosaurs were on the earth. Then you've got the flood. And then after that's the antediluvian era. And that's where we see Noah and then the mutations, 500,000 years. Then we get to Adam, Abraham, blah, 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 blah. The Ice Age then. So when was the Ice Age? So then you got the Ice Age because now you have a global flood. When you have water all over the earth, those plate tectonics are basically little pieces of cereal in a bowl of milk. Like they are shifting everywhere. And he said, he's like, this plate tectonic movement is not going to be the speed of your fingernail growing. It's going to be the speed of someone walking. That's how fast these plates were moving. So then once you have the shifting plate tectonics, the formation of mountains, you've got cold mountains, you've got warm oceans, you've got mass melting, you've got silica from volcanoes coming up, and then you've got freezing. So you've got this like perfect element of things that were freezing and melting at the same time. I'm going to be honest, I was also very confused about this part. However, I think he does a really great job. Definitely go listen to his explanation of it because he takes into account a lot of things like weather that I don't think I fully understand. But he's able to talk about it. So when were the pyramids amidst this entire biblical timeline? And he says the secular date is going to say that the pyramids occurred before the flood. That's how old the pyramids are. They're going to happen pre-flood. But how do we make limestone? From the elements of what the flood caused. Those are limestone rocks. Let's say that there was limestone and they created the pyramids using limestone and then they built it. And then the flood happened. These rocks made out of limestone are only like 1.5 times heavier than water. So you have a global flood. Obviously, the pyramids are going to be submerged. You got a 1 mile an hour current. You could push over the pyramids. They would have floated away. And then also, the rocks were made using the flood derived limestone, not before. So I think we can date it to like right around the time that you're starting to be built during Abraham's time. So, yeah, I think one of the biggest things to take out of this conversation is like we focused mostly on the Egyptian history. We didn't get really into anything else. So, if you have periods within the secular timeline that you feel like you're not able to place within the biblical timeline, DM me on Instagram, find me. This is Biblically Speaking on Instagram, on TikTok, but I'm never on TikTok, on YouTube even you could comment, but I am the most active every single day on Instagram. DM me because I'm going to bring back Dr. Carter I think in like 6 months. And we're going to revisit this conversation. So send me a DM. This is Biblically Speaking on Instagram. Comment on the podcast here. Comment on YouTube. Join the community if you want to talk with a scholar coming up in about a month. But is there a period within the secular timeline that I haven't questioned him about that you're not able to place? I mean, we talked about like nothing. We talked about dinosaurs, ice age, pyramids. What else? What else do you need that placement for? Because there are answers. Seek and you will find. Ask for wisdom and it will be given abundantly without fault. That's the God that we serve. So if you enjoyed this conversation, I'm glad because I enjoyed it way more than you. This is something I've been waiting to do. Talking with any scholar of his Genesis history is such a treat. So thank you for listening to my rant. I did not do it justice. So if you want to actually know what Dr. Carter said, go listen to the episode. It's on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music. It's episode 47, and how do we align the biblical and the secular world timeline. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next week.